now we're getting into the mid 90s when I really took off and started playing a lot of video games, So, the three games I'm going to talk about today are going to be Resident Evil, Super Mario 64, and Final Fantasy 7. We've got three heavy hitters right here, guys. Oh, I almost dropped the book. Three games. Two of those three are from my favorite game series of all time. So let's go to page 216 and talk about Resident Evil. 216, baby. All right, so how it works, guys, you flip to the page and it has the game, and it has about 3 to 5 bullet points. And I read like 2 or 3 of them. I don't read every single one because, again, I don't want to spoil this too much. I don't want to read everything. I want you to buy this book because it's pretty neat. All right, so page 216. Resident Evil, 1996. Let's read the introduction. Excuse me. I have to burp. Excuse me. Few are the games that can claim to be the source of the labeling of a subgenre and of a whole gaming trend. This is the case with Resident Evil from Capcom 1996 regarding the action-adventure survival horror genre. Yet Resident Evil was not an innovative game. Rather, the designer Shinji Mikami and his team have used the elements of prior works for their own ends as well as the technological limitations of the PlayStation 1. And the game has set the characteristic features of horror video games. It has literally opened doors to a new emotional experience. And this chapter explains how. Insofar as Resident Evil has been discussed a lot, I'll solely be backtracking here and collecting all the relevant aspects that make it a key video game. Let's read the first bullet point, which is titled An Interactive Horror Movie. Resident Evil might never have made it into history and remain hidden in the shadow of another famed zombie video game released the same year, the arcade light gun rail shooter House of the Dead by Sega. Indeed, asked to make a horror videoludic work to follow Capcom's role-playing game Sweet Home from 1989 on the Nintendo Famicom, and rather than deploying the same top-down view on a maze-like manner, Mikami first wished to design everything in full 3D with a first-person perspective. However, the PlayStation hardware could not render everything in 3D without sacrificing the quality of the graphics, and this was working against his original intention. As Mikami stated, quote, "What I really wanted to do was make a horror movie where you could become the main character and experience all the fear and you could decide what to do. I was aiming for the type of horror entertainment that is not possible in the form of a movie." End quote. The opening cutscene is, as a matter of fact, film in live-action footage, and is well known for not being very good. Through dark and shaky images, mostly close-ups and medium shots, the Alpha team from the Police Department's Special Tactics and Rescue Service, STARS, is attacked by ferocious beasts in the forest northwest of Raccoon City, while looking for a previous team gone missing during an inquiry about cannibal attacks. The team is forced to escape into a nearby mansion and to investigate the premises. Although it was created during a time where the interactive movie genre was developing, Resident Evil is not a full-motion video game. It did not propose a branching structure and interactivity reduced to limited and punctual decisions. Opportunely, Mikami went for another design. Alright, let's read the next bullet point, which is blind space, blind spots, and doors. Resident Evil's protagonists, monsters, and items were modeled in real-time 3D, while the environment was pre-rendered. This allowed the creation of detailed, gruesome, and sinister locations suitable to the horror genre. Furthermore, Alex Innios asserts, Resident Evil is considered at the time of its release as a Michelangelo ceiling. But such a technique was not new. Although Mikami denied it for nearly 20 years, he did admit it in a Le Monde interview in 2014. That's in parentheses. Journalists and reviewers of the time did not fail to underline the resemblance. Resident Evil was actually a replication of the schema of Alone in the Dark. This action-adventure French video game designed by Frédéric Raynal in 1992 had groundbreakingly merged 3D polygons for characters, enemies, and items, and pre-rendered 2D images for backgrounds. It had developed filmic, predefined camera angles. It had given the choice between a female or male protagonist, as Resident Evil will, locked in a mansion full of deadly creatures and surprises, and in need of managing an inventory to get out alive. That being said, Resident Evil will not be a simple clone. It will make the videoludic proposition of Alone in the Dark much scarier. The pre-rendering of the settings had two implications. First, the position of the camera presenting the scenes had to be predefined. And second, the virtual space had to be shown in different parts, inasmuch as no camera was yet continuously moving around. Consequently, it is by means of film montage that the spatial articulation had to take place. Like a good movie buff, George A. Romero's zombie flicks were his references. Mikami has used these constraints to his advantage with the aim of exploiting the possibilities of framing and shot assembling. He did it perfectly in a moment now canonical in the annals of scary video games. When Jill Valentine or Chris Redfield, the two playable characters with some variations in their path, cross a corridor at the beginning of their search of the mansion, a change in angle shows them moving away from the camera, while a dog bursts from a window along with loud shattering, wisely framed on the right side and in the foreground of the image. If the player continues running and turns the corner of the corridor, a second dog will appear in a similar fashion, but from the left and with Jill or Chris coming from the back and walking toward it. These two jump scares have set the stage for what it means to play Resident Evil. As one will understand, if there is one term that has been employed to qualify Capcom's game, it is well and truly cinematic, and not just due to the presentation of the cutscenes in letterbox format, one of the first featuring a gruesome zombie turning around in close-up toward the player. Similar to the moment just described, and not always from the best position to face a hazard, the camera viewpoints are varied, showing the premises from different distances, the front and the back, the right and the left, a low and high camera angle, the side and the top-down view, and so on. Excuse me. For the player, this entails not knowing how the next location will be visualized and where Jill or Chris will stand in the frame. They therefore were constantly required to scan the new shot and to be attentive. In fact, they had to stay alert. There is one film technique that Mikami will greatly bring into play, namely what Pascal Bonitzer called the blind space. Insofar as a frame inherently leaves its surrounding unseen, the off-screen space became as important as the on-screen. According to Bonitzer, quote, "The enemy is virtually everywhere if the vision is partial. The zombies and other bioweapons populating the manor and threatening the STARS agent could effectively spring unexpectedly from any side of the frame." To add to this tension, Mikami went further. Quote, "Even if you knew before looking around a corner that a zombie was going to be there, we set up blind spots so that players wouldn't be able to see the zombies immediately, and that in turn produced an uneasy feeling that caused players to feel afraid." Close quote. In an opposite manner, the living dead could also be heard before being seen, so as to let the player anticipate a harsh encounter. Another limitation linked to the rendering of the game world has been used in a significant way. The loading screens between areas were presented as movements through the different doors of the mansion, or as taking the stairs. In place of a simple timeout, these transitions built a constant foreboding. In addition to not knowing where the threat could come from, the player never knew what was waiting ahead. Following Poole, quote, "Perhaps the greatest reason for the game's success is the virtuosic tempo. Periods of wandering through deserted environments with annoying sense of unease are interrupted by startling high adrenaline events. Close quote. This tempo is due to the fact that Resident Evil is an action and adventure game. Items such as keys, emblems, and crests must be located and collected to be able to progress. The next bullet point is titled Lack of Control, Power, and Means. And the next bullet point says to keep surviving the horror. I'm going to save those for y'all to read on y'all's own. Again, definitely check this book out. I don't want to spoil all of it for you. Alright, so let's move on to the next game. That was Resident Evil. Let's talk about Super Mario 64 on page 257. This is a game that I played at Toys R Us on the demo, you know? And I never owned an NES, SNES, or N64 or GameCube, so I'm not too familiar with this game, but everybody knows Super Mario 64, so I think it'd be cool to read about it. So, Super Mario 64, 1996. From 1985 to 1995, Nintendo had delivered 8 games featuring their mascot, in super form, that defined and popularized the platform genre. Their successful formula of the linear 2D game had evolved over the years to feature new characters, abilities, power-ups, and richer visuals. But in 1996, with the release of Nintendo's new console dawning, the N64, the idea that Super Mario was now going to be in 3D was met with apprehension as well as excitement. How would a 3D Mario game work, given that the proven 2D formula would be incompatible with 3D space? Many speculated that the idea would not work, but as we would learn, the predictions were themselves two-dimensional. As Edge magazine put in the opening of their review in August of 1996, quote, "If Nintendo aimed to set itself a tough task, choosing to make the first N64 title a continuation of the most legendary series of video games in history must rank as the most demanding one imaginable. Mario's lineage, after all, is a concertedly two-dimensional one, and hardly ideal material upon which to base what was destined to be the most intensely scrutinized 3D video game of all time." Close quote. As we would learn, Nintendo were not going to simply transfer an old design into 3D. They were going to redefine the game and the genre in the same way as the original. Alright, the first bullet point after that introduction was the next generation. Nintendo had already ventured into 3D on the Super Nintendo, with the introduction of the Super FX chip in order to deliver Star Fox, a 3D rail shooter. Shigeru Miyamoto, Mario's creator, upon seeing Star Fox, conceived the idea of a 3D Mario game. As the internal name of the Super FX chip was referred to as Super Mario FX, or the Mario chip, there was speculation that Super Mario 64 began as an SNES title. It had not, in parentheses it says, Star Fox programmer Dylan Cuthbert confirmed this to be false. Close parentheses. Design on a 3D Mario platformer began in 1993. Development began a year later. I have an itch. And it was released as intended in 1996 as the N64's launch title. There was a clear intention that Nintendo's successor to the Super Nintendo would be a 3D console and that Nintendo would scale back 3D development on the SNES to create a distance that would aid that distinction. This ultimately resulted in Star Fox 2 from 1996, not being released at the time even though it was completed. Nintendo was not going to be the first to introduce a true 3D platformer to the world. That honor belongs to Jumping Flash from Sony Computer Entertainment in 1995, albeit in a first-person perspective. A year later, in 96, we would see 3 further 3D platformers arrive on Sony's PlayStation in order to compete with Nintendo's mascot, Crash Bandicoot, Floating Runner, and Bubsy 3D. Crash Bandicoot definitely looked the part. It had the hallmarks of a Mario game with the introduction of a new cartoony character that Sony would use to compete with Mario and Sonic. And the game even featured a level select map reminiscent of Super Mario World. Though Crash Bandicoot was a success, its 3D implementation was somewhat lacking. The game was composed of linear 3D levels and traditional side-scrolling. This was not really Sony's equivalent of Super Mario 64, but it was seen as the main competitor. Floating Runner lacked depth and quality. Bubsy 3D was criticized for its inappropriate controls and for its overall poor transition from 2D to 3D. It had unintentionally demonstrated the very thing that Nintendo wanted to avoid and that players and critics were worried about. Let's see. Alright, we're going to skip A Whole New World, that bullet point, and we're going to skip the bullet point avatar and player evolution. We're going to go to Super Mario 64's Legacy. This sounds kind of cool. Next bullet point. Nintendo managed to deliver a magical place to explore and experience when playing Super Mario 64. The new open, non-linear gameplay demonstrated the benefits of freedom, as long as there are things to see and do. Shigeru Miyamoto, the game's director, showed his philosophy of rewarding exploration and consistently providing the player with a sense of accomplishment. The levels invite repeat playthroughs to obtain all 120 power stars. You don't need them all, 70 will finish the game, but you will be pulled in trying to get them all. The game is engaging to play and, unlike previous games, is not just about making it through to the end. Sometimes you just want to spend time in the game and run around like a child in a park playground. Through the third dimension, Nintendo has created a happy place to escape to. The reviews were universally positive, and the game received high praise and high scores across the board. Japan's leading game magazine Famitsu awarded it 39 out of 40. Edge gave it a 10 out of 10. Electronic Game Magazine, 9.5 out of 10. IGN, 9.8 out of 10. And GameSpot, 9.4 out of 10. Delaying the game and console launch was vindicated as Nintendo achieved another killer application on day one. From this game onward, Nintendo had successfully transferred a popular franchise from 2D to 3D, paving the way for others from the era to do the same, proving it can be done despite requiring significant changes, which in this case included evolving the genre from a platformer to include action-adventure. Dan Houser from Rockstar, responsible for the Grand Theft Auto series, freely admits to borrowing from the game, and there are numerous references made in the Assassin's Creed games, a realistic take on the platform action-adventure game. Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag director Ashraf Ishmael specifically adds, quote, the best reference I can say for this is effectively like Mario 64. Think about it. You have the castle, which is the ocean, and you have these portals that take you to these really unique worlds where you can come back to these worlds and do a bunch of things. Do collectibles, find stuff that has value for you. That's effectively what it is. But we've taken a much more credible approach to it, obviously. This was the world we decided to build. We wanted a hub world with pockets of maps, and it's really different for Assassin's Creed. And there's an epilogue bullet point, but I'll save that for y'all. So, all right, the third game. Let's talk about Final Fantasy VII. Probably one of, if not my favorite game of all time. So, 3 great games, guys. So this is on page 110. Let's check it out. I'm really excited, man. This is the first, I think the first Final Fantasy game. Oh. Yeah, man. All right. So, Final Fantasy VII, released in 1997. Let's begin. Since its release by Squaresoft in 1997, the cat is crying. Shut up, cat. Final Fantasy VII's powerful narrative has resonated deeply with players. The technological advancements of the PlayStation afforded the game's developers unprecedented artistic freedom, and the resulting game featured immersive 3D graphics and an extensive storyline. the sweeping cinematic cutscenes that illustrated the game's most significant narrative moments were accompanied by rich symphonic music. Finally, the psychologically detailed character backstories enhanced the player's ability to identify with the characters, heightening the emotional impact of the game's narrative. This chapter examines the relationship between these elements more closely, exploring how the increased technical capabilities of the new console contributed to the emotional intensity of some of the game's most poignant narrative moments. So we've got a few bullet points. Let's see. One is called The Franchise. PlayStation changes the game. Narrative experience. And a conclusion. Dun, 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 dun. All right, let's read The Franchise. That's the first bullet point. Let's take a look. Final Fantasy stands out as one of the longest running and best known video game franchises in history. The majority of main titles in the franchise fall into the role-playing game genre, with the exception of two massive multiplayer online RPGs, which are 11 and 14. Additional spin-off games encompass a variety of genres. From fighting games to third-person shooter and tactical RPGs. Originally released for the Nintendo Famicom in Japan in 1987, Final Fantasy's success led to its North American release for the NES in 1990. Releases for several subsequent games in the franchise remain limited to Japanese markets, with the exception of Final Fantasy IV from 91 and 6 in 94. In order to keep naming conventions consistent, Nintendo altered the titles for the North American releases of these games to Final Fantasy II, 1988, and Final Fantasy III from 1990, respectively. When Squaresoft released Final Fantasy VII in 1997, the title remained the same for both international and Japanese audiences, and all subsequent games in the franchise followed suit. Unlike other video game franchises, in which all games tend to share a core universe, each main title game in the Final Fantasy franchise offers a unique game world and experience. Early games featured fantasy plots that generally involved 4 or more playable characters who worked together to save the world from imminent destruction. Due to the technical limitations of early home gaming systems, games produced for the NES and Super NES relied on pixelated 2D graphics and 8 or 16-bit audio. Later games in the franchise, 7 and beyond, featured plots with more complex philosophical and narrative implications, as well as substantially improved graphics and sound capabilities. Main title games in the series, through Final Fantasy X from 2001, share a turn-based RPG format in which players experience random enemy encounters while exploring a dungeon or world map. During these encounters, members of the player's party and enemy combatants select actions, attacking using magic items, etc., during their respective turns or complete the battle. Like their narrative worlds, the action options and rules for determining the sequence of turns varies depending on the game. When considering the franchise as a whole, games produced between the mid-90s and the early 2000s transformed the narrative. Artistic and musical expectations for games bearing the Final Fantasy title. Among the games produced during this critical period, Final Fantasy VII remains the most influential, not only within the franchise, but also for the broader RPG genre. Of all the Final Fantasy titles, Final Fantasy VII possesses the most extensive game universe. More spin-off games and films have been created in association with this game than any other main title in the series. With over 13 million copies sold, it is also the highest-selling game in the franchise, and the first Japanese RPG to break through to North American markets. In addition, the game's success set the tone for future games in the genre more broadly, helping to establish narrative, cinematic, and gameplay expectations for other RPGs designed for the new console. Let's see here. Okay, let's read the next bullet point, which says PlayStation changes the game. As the first main title to be released for the Sony PlayStation, Final Fantasy VII benefited greatly from the expanded hardware capabilities of the new console. According to creator Hironobu Sakaguchi, the increased artistic freedom allowed by the PlayStation directly influenced Squaresoft's decision to leave Nintendo and produce games for Sony instead. The PlayStation's 32-bit processing power and increased storage of the CD format made 3D graphics using pre-rendered backgrounds and polygonal characters possible for the first time in a Final Fantasy title. Unlike earlier games produced for the NES and SNES, in which the limitations of the hardware influenced decisions on narrative content, the PlayStation achieved Sakaguchi's artistic and narrative vision in full. The result was an RPG with a larger world and more complex narrative presentation than any that came before. While gameplay in Final Fantasy VII remained consistent with prior games in the franchise, the technological leap to the PlayStation resulted in notable shifts in the game's visual and narrative presentation. Its cinematic cutscenes acted as critical anchors for the narrative, illustrating key moments of the story in rich visual detail. Due to the 3D graphics, each CGI cutscene acted like a short movie, drawing players deeper into the story and more closely connecting the narrative experience with gameplay elements. Other changes included the presence of blood and the use of explicit language. Although minor, these additions signaled a shift to a more mature target audience and helped reinforce other narrative content, such as the science fiction setting, which re-envisioned the series in a more modern light. Alongside these striking visual and narrative features, the ability to produce CD quality sound significantly increased the narrative impact of the music, which directly informs players' emotional responses to the game events. In composing the music for Final Fantasy VII, Nobuo Uematsu chose to rely on MIDI, which allowed for more dynamic music with fewer repetitive loops and quicker transitions between tracks. With the PlayStation, Uematsu had 24 channels of 16-bit sound at his disposal, far more than the 8 channels available on the SNES. As a result, the soundtrack for Final Fantasy VII featured more complex musical textures and more realistic instrument sounds than those heard in previous titles. A full symphonic score accompanied the game's striking cinematics, and tracks like One Winged Angel, the music associated with the final boss battle, quickly became fan favorites. Alright, the next bullet point is narrative experience in Final Fantasy VII and a conclusion. So I'm going to save my breath for that one. That one seems like a juicy one too, but I'm going to let y'all save that for y'all. Alright, that was today's select book reading of 50 key video games. We talked about Final Fantasy VII. We talked about Super Mario 64 and Resident Evil. So a couple of my favorite game series of all time and games. Oh, my cat's crying. One of my 3 cats is crying.